The old bus groaned to a halt, its brakes screeching in protest against the steep mountain road. Daniel Lockhart peered out the grimy window, squinting against the fading autumn light. Valens Hollow lay before him, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled in a valley that seemed to have been gouged out of the mountainside by some ancient, colossal hand. As he stepped off the bus, the chill mountain air bit at his skin, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something old and vaguely unsettling. Daniel shrugged it off, attributing the unease to his frayed nerves. After all, wasn't that why he'd come to this remote village? To escape the cacophony of the city, the constant reminders of his loss, the pitying glances of colleagues. The bus rumbled away, leaving Daniel alone on the narrow road that served as the village's main street. A few curious faces peered out from behind curtains, quickly disappearing when he turned to look. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cawing of a crow. Daniel hefted his bag and began walking towards the village's only inn, a squat two-story building with a faded sign that creaked in the wind. As he approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned, scanning the tree line that bordered the village. There at the edge of the forest he saw them. 3 figures stood motionless, their forms barely distinguishable from the lengthening shadows. They were human in shape, but something about their stillness made Daniel's skin crawl. Even from this distance he could feel the weight of their gaze upon him. "Don't mind them." A gravelly voice startled Daniel from his trance. An old man had emerged from the inn, his weathered face creased with a forced smile. "They don't do nothing but stand there." "Who are they?" Daniel asked. His journalist's curiosity piqued despite the chill that ran down his spine. The old man's smile faltered, his eyes darting nervously to the distant figures. "We don't talk about them," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Best you come inside now. Night's falling, and it ain't safe to be out after dark. Not anymore." As Daniel followed the old man into the inn, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. The figures hadn't moved, but Daniel could have sworn there were now 4 of them, their hollow eyes fixed unwaveringly on the village. The inn's door closed behind him with a finality that felt like a portent. Little did Daniel know that he had just stepped into a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. The inn's interior was a study in faded charm and lingering unease. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with faded photographs and mounted animal heads. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the glassy eyes of the taxidermied beasts followed his every move. "Name's Jeremiah," the old man said, shuffling behind a worn wooden counter. "Don't get many visitors these days. What brings you to Valens Hollow, Mr. Lockhart?" "Daniel Lockhart," he replied, setting his bag down. "I'm a writer. Came here looking for some peace and quiet to work on my next piece." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Peace and quiet, you say? Well, you've come to the right place, and the wrong time." Before Daniel could inquire further, the innkeeper thrust a heavy iron key into his hand. "Rooms upstairs, last door on the left. Dinner's at 7, but don't expect much. Supplies have been unreliable lately." As Daniel climbed the creaking stairs, he could hear Jeremiah muttering to himself, the words silent ones and coming closer, barely audible. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a desk beneath a window that looked out over the village square. Daniel's eyes were immediately drawn to the tree line beyond. The figures were still there, their number now increased to 6. Even in the deepening twilight, their stillness was unnatural, unsettling. Dinner was a subdued affair. A handful of villagers huddled around tables in the inn's common room, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent whenever Daniel approached. The stew was thin and flavorless, but Daniel barely noticed, his mind preoccupied with the mystery that seemed to shroud Valens Hollow. As he ate, he caught snippets of conversation. Saw old Miller's boy talking to one of them. Cattle found dead in the north pasture, not a mark on them. Getting closer every night. When he tried to ask about the figures at the forest's edge, he was met with averted gazes and mumbled excuses. Only one villager, a young woman with haunted eyes, dared to meet his gaze. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They know you're here now, they'll be watching you." Before Daniel could press for more information, the woman hurried away, leaving him alone with his half-eaten stew and a growing sense of dread. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, the silence of Valens Hollow pressed in on him like a physical weight. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the old inn settling. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a sound jolted him awake. It was barely audible, a whisper so faint it might have been imagination. But as Daniel strained his ears, he heard it again, his name carried on a breath of wind that shouldn't exist in the still night air. Daniel Lockhart. Heart-pounding, he rose and went to the window. The village square was bathed in pale moonlight, empty save for a lone figure standing directly below his window. It stood perfectly still, its face upturned, staring at him with hollow, unblinking eyes. As Daniel watched, frozen in horror, the figure's mouth opened in a silent scream, and then with a blink it was gone, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. Sleep eluded Daniel for the rest of the night. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, he made a decision. He would uncover the truth behind the silent ones, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the cost might be higher than he could ever imagine. The following morning dawned gray and oppressive, a thick mist clinging to the village like a burial shroud. Daniel descended to the inn's common room, the floorboards creaking ominously under his feet. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and fear. Jeremiah stood behind the counter, his gnarled hands methodically polishing a glass that had long since lost its shine. His eyes, rheumy and distant, snapped to Daniel as he approached. "Saw you at the window last night," the old man muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saw one of them, didn't you?" Daniel nodded, a chill running down his spine at the memory. "What are they, Jeremiah? What's happening to this village?" The innkeeper's eyes darted nervously to the windows, as if expecting to see pale faces pressed against the glass. "It's not for outsiders to know," he said, but his resolve seemed to waver. After a moment's hesitation, he continued, "But maybe you're here for a reason. Come with me." Jeremiah led Daniel to a small, cluttered office behind the kitchen. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. "This is the village history," he explained, his fingers trembling as he opened it. "It speaks of the silent ones and the curse that brings them." As Daniel leafed through the fragile pages, a story unfolded before him. Centuries ago, Valens Hollow had been home to a sect of occultists who practiced dark rituals in the surrounding mountains. They had summoned something from beyond the veil of reality, something that should never have been brought into this world. The entity, formless and vast, had demanded a terrible price for the knowledge it offered: silence. One by one, the cultists had their voices stripped away, becoming the first of the silent ones. But the entity's hunger was insatiable. It continued to claim voices, reaching beyond the cultists to the innocent villagers. In desperation, the remaining villagers had performed a ritual to bind the entity, trapping it in a place between worlds. But the binding was imperfect, weakening over time. Every generation, the silent ones would return, harbingers of the entity's imminent awakening. "The binding is failing," Jeremiah whispered, his voice heavy with dread. "Each night more of them appear. Soon the entity will break free, and all will be claimed by silence." As if to punctuate his words, a scream pierced the air outside. Daniel rushed to the window, Jeremiah hobbling behind him. In the village square, a woman stood rigid with terror, pointing towards the tree line. The silent ones had moved. No longer content to watch from afar, they now stood at the very edge of the village, their blank faces turned towards the buildings. There were dozens of them now, an army of the voiceless. Among them, Daniel spotted a familiar face, the young woman who had warned him at dinner the previous night. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty and unseeing. She had joined the ranks of the silent ones. As Daniel watched, heart-pounding, he saw one of the figures twitch, its head turning slowly, inexorably, until its hollow gaze met his own. A voice, not heard but felt, echoed in the depths of his mind. "Soon, Daniel Lockhart, soon you too will know the blessing of silence." Daniel staggered back from the window, his mind reeling. He turned to Jeremiah, questions burning on his lips, but the words died in his throat. The old innkeeper stood motionless, his eyes fixed and vacant, mouth open in a silent scream. The Silent Ones had claimed another victim, and Daniel was alone with the terrible knowledge of what was to come. Panic gripped Daniel as he watched Jeremiah's vacant eyes, the old man's body swaying slightly like a marionette with cut strings. In that moment, the inn seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening, the air growing thick and oppressive. With a strangled cry, Daniel fled the inn, bursting out into the misty morning. The village square was deserted, an eerie silence hanging over the shuttered buildings. The Silent Ones still stood at the village's edge, their hollow gazes fixed on the town, on him. Daniel ran, his feet pounding against the dirt road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had no destination in mind, driven only by the primal need to escape the horror that had claimed Jeremiah. As he reached the outskirts of the village, a gnarled hand shot out from behind a dilapidated fence, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Fool boy," a raspy voice hissed. "You'll bring them down on us all." Daniel found himself face to face with an ancient woman, her skin like crumpled parchment, eyes milky with cataracts, yet sharp with intelligence and fear. She pulled him through a hidden gate, into an overgrown garden behind a ramshackle cottage. "I am Mara," the old woman said, ushering Daniel inside the dim interior of her home. "And you, city boy, have stumbled into a nightmare older than those mountains." The cottage was cluttered with books, strange artifacts, and bundles of dried herbs that filled the air with a pungent aroma. Mara moved with the assurance of the blind, navigating the chaos with ease. "You've seen them, haven't you? Felt their gaze upon you?" Mara asked, her sightless eyes somehow finding Daniel's face. "They are but the harbingers, the silent vanguard of something far worse." Daniel's journalistic instincts kicked in, momentarily overriding his fear. "The entity," he said. "Jeremiah showed me the town history. What is it? How can it be stopped?" Mara cackled, a sound devoid of humor. "Stopped? Oh, you foolish child. It cannot be stopped, only appeased. The ritual must be performed, the sacrifice made, or all will be consumed by the silence." She shuffled to a rickety bookshelf, pulling out a tome bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. "The old fools thought they could bind it, control it," she muttered, leafing through the pages. "But such power cannot be contained. It sleeps, it waits, and now it hungers." Daniel watched as Mara's gnarled finger traced lines of text in a language he didn't recognize. "The ritual," he pressed. "What does it entail?" Mara's head snapped up, her unseeing eyes locking onto Daniel with unnerving accuracy. "Blood," she whispered. "Blood freely given by one who has heard the entity's call. But beware, for in the giving, one may lose more than just blood." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "And if the ritual isn't performed? Then the Silent Ones will claim us all one by one, until the village falls silent. And then..." Mara's voice trailed off, her face contorting in fear. "And then the entity will be free to spread its silence across the world." As if in response to her words, a low, distant hum began to fill the air. It was barely perceptible at first, more felt than heard, but it grew steadily in intensity. Daniel moved to the window, peering out into the mist-shrouded garden. The Silent Ones had moved again. They now stood in a perfect circle around Mara's cottage, their blank faces turned towards the building. As Daniel watched, their mouths began to open in unison, wider and wider, beyond the limits of human anatomy. The hum grew to a deafening roar, and Daniel clapped his hands over his ears, falling to his knees. Through the pain he heard Mara's voice, thin and frightened. "They've found us. The choice is upon you, Daniel Lockhart. Will you give your blood to the ritual or your voice to the silence?" As the sound reached an unbearable crescendo, Daniel felt something warm trickle from his ears. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Mara's face, contorted in a silent scream, as the shadows in the cottage seemed to come alive, reaching for them both with tendrils of inky darkness. Consciousness returned to Daniel slowly, like a man swimming up from the depths of a murky lake. His head throbbed, and the taste of copper lingered in his mouth. As his eyes flickered open, he found himself lying on the floor of Mara's cottage, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt herbs. You're awake. Mara's voice came from somewhere to his left. I feared they had claimed you. Daniel sat up gingerly, his vision swimming. What happened? The old woman sat in a rocking chair, her unseeing eyes fixed on a point beyond the cottage walls. They tried to take you, she said, her voice hollow. I used the last of my safeguards to drive them back, but it won't hold for long. As Daniel's senses cleared, he noticed changes in the cottage. Symbols were burned into the wooden floors and walls, forming intricate patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The windows were covered with thick black cloth and candles guttered in every corner, their flames an unnatural blue. How long was I out? Daniel asked, struggling to his feet. Time has little meaning when the veil grows thin, Mara replied cryptically. But the sun has set and risen twice since you fell. 2 days. Daniel had lost 2 days. He stumbled to one of the covered windows, pulling aside the cloth. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The village was transformed. An unnatural mist clung to everything, and in that mist, shapes moved, fluid, undefined things that hurt the eye to look upon. The silent ones stood on every corner, their numbers vastly increased. But worst of all was the sky. Where once there had been stars, now there was only a vast swirling void, a blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. What's happening? Daniel whispered, his voice choked with horror. Mara joined him at the window, her face grim. The binding weakens, the entity stirs. Soon it will break through and all will be lost to the silence. The ritual, Daniel said, turning to her. You said it could appease the entity. We have to try. Mara's laugh was bitter. And where will we find one who has heard the entity's call, willing to give their blood freely? The price is high, Daniel Lockhart. Higher than you know. As she spoke, a memory stirred in Daniel's mind. The whisper of his name on the wind. The figure beneath his window at the inn. A chill ran down his spine as realization dawned. It called to me, he said softly. That first night in the village, it knows my name. Mara's unseeing eyes widened, a mix of fear and hope crossing her weathered features. Then you are the one, she breathed. You can perform the ritual, but be warned, the entity is cunning. It will try to take more than you offer. Daniel's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run from this nightmare and never look back. But as he gazed out at the dying village, at the silent ones who had once been people with lives and voices, he knew he couldn't abandon them. What do I need to do? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Mara moved with sudden urgency, gathering items from around the cottage. A silver knife, a bowl of dark stone, herbs that smelled of grave dirt and stranger things. We must go to the old altar in the mountains, she said, the place where the entity was first summoned. There you will make your offering. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the cottage, a sound reached them, a low rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel looked out the window once more and felt his heart skip a beat. The silent ones were on the move, forming a vast procession that wound through the village streets. At their head walked a figure that Daniel recognized with a jolt of horror, Jeremiah, the innkeeper, his eyes still vacant but his mouth moving in time with the otherworldly chant. They're coming, Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. Mara nodded grimly. Then we have no time to lose. Come, Daniel Lockhart. Your date with destiny awaits in the mountains, and may whatever gods still listen have mercy on your soul. With a final glance at the approaching horde, Daniel helped Mara gather the ritual items. Together, they slipped out the back of the cottage into the mist-shrouded woods beyond. As they began their ascent into the mountains, the chanting grew louder, and Daniel could have sworn he heard his name woven into the eldritch syllables. The final confrontation loomed, and Daniel Lockhart, a simple journalist seeking solitude, found himself the linchpin in a cosmic drama beyond his wildest nightmares. The forest closed around Daniel and Mara like a living thing, branches reaching out with gnarled fingers, roots threatening to trip them at every step. The mist grew thicker as they ascended, muffling all sound save for their labored breathing and the distant, persistent chanting of the silent ones. How much further? Daniel gasped, helping Mara over a particularly treacherous stretch of rock. The old woman's unseeing eyes seemed to peer through the mist. "Not far now," she wheezed. "The veil grows thin, can you feel it?" Daniel could. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy, making his skin crawl and his thoughts scatter like frightened birds. Shadows moved at the corner of his vision, taking on shapes that defied comprehension before melting back into the mist. As they climbed higher, the vegetation grew sparse and twisted, as if warped by some malevolent force. Pale, luminous fungi clung to the rocks, pulsing in time with the distant chanting. Daniel found himself grateful for Mara's blindness, sparing her from the nightmarish landscape. They crested a ridge and suddenly the altar stood before them. It was an ancient thing of rough-hewn stone, etched with symbols that hurt Daniel's eyes to look upon. Around it, the very air seemed to ripple and distort, as if reality itself was struggling to maintain its integrity. "We're here," Mara announced, her voice tight with fear and anticipation. "Quickly now, we must prepare the ritual before they arrive." As Daniel helped Mara set up the ritual components, a sound reached them that made his blood run cold. The chanting was growing louder, no longer distant, but approaching rapidly. The silent ones were coming. "They're close," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. Mara nodded grimly. "Then we have no time to lose. Listen carefully, Daniel Lockhart. You must cut your palm and let your blood flow onto the altar. As it does, recite these words." She leaned in close, whispering a phrase in a language that made Daniel's ears ache. Daniel's hand trembled as he took the silver knife. The chanting grew louder still, and through the mist he could see shapes moving, dozens, perhaps hundreds of figures slowly ascending the mountain. "Whatever happens," Mara said, gripping his arm with surprising strength, "do not stop the ritual once it's begun. The entity will try to distract you, to tempt you. Resist, or all is lost." Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped up to the altar. The silver blade flashed in the eerie light as he drew it across his palm. Blood welled up, shockingly red against the gray stone. As it dripped onto the altar, Daniel began to recite the words Mara had taught him. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The air around the altar began to twist and warp, colors that had no place in nature flashing through the mist. The chanting of the silent ones rose to a fevered pitch, and Daniel could see them now, emerging from the mist, their blank faces turned towards him. But it was the voice that truly tested Daniel's resolve. It came not from without, but from within his own mind, vast and ancient and utterly alien. Daniel Lockhart, it resonated through his very being. Why do you resist? Embrace the silence and know peace eternal. Visions flashed before Daniel's eyes, himself as one of the silent ones, free from pain, from fear, from the burdens of consciousness. It was seductive, tempting in its simplicity. "Don't listen," Mara's voice cut through the fog in his mind. "It lies! Finish the ritual!" Gritting his teeth, Daniel forced himself to continue the chant. His blood flowed freely now, forming intricate patterns on the altar stone. The silent ones pressed closer, their mouths opening impossibly wide, as if to swallow him whole. As Daniel spoke the final words of the ritual, a deafening roar filled the air. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a moment, Daniel glimpsed something vast and incomprehensible beyond the veil of reality, a presence so alien and terrifying that his mind recoiled from it. Then abruptly, silence fell. The mist dissipated and the silent ones stood frozen like statues on the mountainside. Had it worked? Had the entity been appeased? But as Daniel turned to Mara, hope rising in his chest, he saw the old woman's face contort in horror. "No," she whispered. "Oh gods, no. What have we done?" And then Daniel felt it. A presence in his mind, vast and cold and utterly inhuman. The voice spoke once more, but this time, it was no longer trying to tempt him. It was claiming him. "Thank you, Daniel Lockhart," it said, its tone one of cruel amusement, "for giving us the key." As darkness closed in around him, Daniel realized with dawning horror that the ritual hadn't stopped the entity. It had invited it in. Consciousness returned to Daniel in fragments, each more horrifying than the last. He was aware of his body, but it felt wrong, as if his skin had become an ill-fitting suit. The world around him pulsed with alien colors and impossible geometries. and in his mind the entity's presence loomed vast and cold and unutterably alien. What's happening to me? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper, each word a struggle against the encroaching silence. Mara knelt beside him, her unseeing eyes wide with terror. "The ritual," she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't meant to appease the entity. It was a key, unlocking the last of its bonds. And you, Daniel Lockhart, have become its vessel. Horror washed over Daniel as the full implications of her words sank in. He could feel the entity moving within him, reshaping him from the inside out. Knowledge flooded his mind. Terrible, beautiful, maddening knowledge of realities beyond human comprehension. Around them, the silent ones began to stir. Their blank faces turned towards Daniel, and as one, they sank to their knees in supplication. The entity's voice echoed in Daniel's mind, using his thoughts as a conduit to address its followers. "The time of silence is at hand," it proclaimed through Daniel. "The veil will be torn asunder, and all shall know the peace of eternal quiet." Daniel fought against the entity's control, clinging desperately to his sense of self. "No," he gasped. "I won't let you use me like this. I won't be your puppet." But even as he resisted, he could feel his will eroding. The entity's consciousness was vast, its patience infinite. It had waited eons for this moment, and it would not be denied. Mara grabbed Daniel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me," she hissed. "There's still a chance. The ritual can be undone, but the price—" She hesitated, fear and resolve warring on her weathered face. "The price is steep. A life freely given to seal the breach." Understanding dawned on Daniel, bringing with it a mix of terror and grim determination. "My life," he said softly, "to undo what I've done." Mara nodded, tears streaming from her sightless eyes. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I never meant for this to happen. I thought the old stories were just legends." As they spoke, the world around them continued to unravel. The sky above had become a roiling mass of impossible colors, and in the distance, mountains twisted into shapes that defied Euclidean geometry. The silent ones pressed closer, their mouths opening in a soundless chorus of adoration for their newly embodied god. Daniel struggled to his feet, fighting against the entity's control with every fiber of his being. "Tell me what to do," he said to Mara, his voice strained but resolute. The old woman quickly explained the counter-ritual, her words nearly lost in the rising psychic cacophony that surrounded them. The entity, sensing Daniel's intentions, redoubled its efforts to subsume his consciousness. Visions flashed before Daniel's eyes, worlds beyond imagination, knowledge that would drive most men to madness, power beyond reckoning. All this could be his, if only he surrendered to the silence. "Don't listen," Mara's voice cut through the temptation. "Remember who you are, Daniel Lockhart." With a Herculean effort of will, Daniel began the counter-ritual. Each word was a battle torn from his throat as the entity raged within him. Blood flowed anew from his wound, sizzling as it hit the altar stone. As Daniel spoke the final words of the ritual, he felt a great tearing sensation, as if his very soul was being ripped apart. The entity howled in fury and desperation, its vast consciousness thrashing against the bonds that once again began to form. A blinding light erupted from the altar, enveloping Daniel. He felt himself falling, dissolving, becoming one with the light. His last conscious thought was a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that the nightmare was ending, regret for the life he would never return to. As the light faded, silence once again fell over the mountain. Mara, blinded by more than just her physical affliction, reached out with trembling hands. Where Daniel had stood, she felt only empty air. The silent ones stood motionless, their blank faces betraying no emotion. Slowly, one by one, they began to collapse, strings cut from a cosmic puppet show that had reached its final act. Mara sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered to the empty air. "Oh, Daniel, what have we done? What have we undone?" But as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the twisted landscape in hues of normalcy, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It might have been imagination, or perhaps something more. A final echo from beyond the veil. "The silence is broken, but at what cost?" In the days that followed, Valens Hollow struggled to return to a semblance of normalcy. The Silent Ones had vanished with the dawn, leaving behind a village populated by shell-shocked survivors and the empty homes of those who had been claimed. Mara, guided by the village children, made her way from house to house, offering what comfort she could. The burden of knowledge weighed heavily upon her. She alone knew the full truth of what had transpired on the mountain. As life slowly resumed its rhythm, strange occurrences persisted. Villagers reported hearing whispers on the wind, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Objects would move of their own accord, and sometimes, in the corner of one's eye, a figure might be glimpsed, only to vanish when looked at directly. 2 weeks after the events on the mountain, a stranger arrived in Valens Hollow. She was a tall, severe-looking woman who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Vance, a parapsychologist from Miskatonic University. "I'm here to investigate the recent disturbances," she told the wary villagers. "I understand you've experienced some unusual phenomena." The villagers, still traumatized by their ordeal, were reluctant to speak. But Dr. Vance was persistent, and slowly, pieces of the story began to emerge. It was Jeremiah, the innkeeper, who finally directed her to Mara. "If you want to know what really happened," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "talk to the old witch in the woods. She knows more than she should." Dr. Vance found Mara in her cottage, surrounded by books and strange artifacts. The old woman seemed to have aged years in the span of weeks. "I've been expecting you," Mara said as Dr. Vance entered. "The stars whispered of your coming." For hours, Mara recounted the tale of the Silent Ones, of Daniel Lockhart's arrival and his ultimate sacrifice. Dr. Vance listened with growing horror and fascination. "This entity," she said when Mara had finished, "you believe it's been banished?" Mara's unseeing eyes seemed to look through Dr. Vance. "Banished? No. Contained, perhaps. But such things can never truly be banished. They wait, patient beyond human reckoning, for another chance." As if to underscore her words, a sudden chill filled the room. The candles flickered, and for a moment a shadow seemed to loom over them, a vast, formless thing that receded as quickly as it had appeared. Dr. Vance left Mara's cottage with more questions than answers. As she walked back to the village, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, as she lay in bed at the inn, Dr. Vance dreamed. She stood on a vast, dark plain under an alien sky. Before her, a figure flickered in and out of existence, sometimes appearing as Daniel Lockhart, other times as something far less human. "The silence is broken," the figure said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "But the echoes remain. Listen closely, Dr. Vance. Listen, and prepare." She awoke with a start, the dream already fading. But as she reached for her notebook to jot down what she remembered, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the desk, written in a hand not her own, were 3 words. "It isn't over." Dr. Vance stared at the message, her scientific mind warring with the implications of what she had seen and heard. In that moment, she made a decision that would set her on a path from which there was no return. She would stay in Valens Hollow. She would investigate further. And perhaps in doing so, she would uncover truths that mankind was never meant to know. As dawn broke over the village, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Dr. Vance couldn't help but wonder, had the nightmare truly ended, or was it only just beginning? As weeks turned into months, Dr. Eleanor Vance's presence became a fixture in Valens Hollow. The villagers, initially wary of the outsider, gradually came to accept her as she tirelessly documented their experiences and sought to understand the lingering effects of the entity's near manifestation. Her research led her to uncover layers of the village's history that had long been buried. In dusty town archives and half-forgotten family heirlooms, she found references to cycles of silence that had plagued Valens Hollow for centuries. Each generation had its own tales of the Silent Ones, though never had the threat come so close to fruition as it had with Daniel Lockhart. One crisp autumn evening, as Dr. Vance pored over her notes in the inn's common room, a commotion outside drew her attention. A group of villagers had gathered in the square, their faces pale with fear. "It's happening again," one of them said as Dr. Vance approached. "The whispers, they're back." Indeed, as twilight deepened into night, an unnatural hush fell over Valens Hollow. The wind died down, and in the silence, faint whispers could be heard, unintelligible words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Vance felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard similar reports before, but never had she witnessed the phenomenon herself. As she stood there, straining to make out the whispers, a realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The whispers were not random. They had a pattern, a rhythm almost like music. With growing excitement and trepidation, Dr. Vance rushed back to her room, rifling through her notes until she found what she was looking for, a transcription of the ritual Daniel had performed on the mountain. As she compared the cadence of the whispers to the words of the ritual, her suspicions were confirmed. The whispers were an echo of the ritual, repeating endlessly in the fabric of reality itself. But what did it mean? Was it merely a resonance, an after-effect of the cosmic forces that had been unleashed? Or was it something more sinister, a gradual weakening of the barriers that kept the entity at bay? Dr. Vance knew she needed help to unravel this mystery. She sent urgent messages to her colleagues at Miskatonic University, calling for expertise in fields ranging from quantum physics to ancient languages. As she waited for responses, the phenomena in Valens Hollow intensified. Villagers reported seeing strange lights in the forest, and some claimed to have glimpsed shadowy figures that vanished when directly observed. The whispers grew louder, and some of the younger residents began to complain of headaches and strange dreams. It was Mara who provided the next piece of the puzzle. The old woman appeared at Dr. Vance's door one night, her unseeing eyes wide with fear. "I've seen it," she gasped, clutching Dr. Vance's arm. "In my dreams, I've seen what's coming. The ritual didn't just close the door, it created a link, a tether between our world and the entity's realm. And that link, it's Daniel Lockhart." Dr. Vance felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Mara's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's trapped between worlds, neither here nor there, and the entity is using him, using his connection to our reality to slowly, inexorably, pull itself through." As if in response to Mara's words, a tremor ran through the ground. In the distance, a sound like the ringing of an immense bell echoed across the valley. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and for a moment Dr. Vance thought she could make out words. "The silence returns, the door opens, we are coming." In that moment, Dr. Eleanor Vance understood the true nature of the threat they faced. The battle for Valens Hollow, for reality itself, was far from over. It had merely entered a new, more dangerous phase. As the whispers faded and an uneasy calm settled over the village, Dr. Vance made a grim resolution. She would find a way to sever the link between worlds, to truly banish the entity, and free Daniel Lockhart from his cosmic purgatory. But as she looked out over the darkened village, seeing fear etched on every face, she couldn't help but wonder, was such a thing even possible? Or were they all merely delaying the inevitable, as the silence inexorably closed in around them? The following week saw Valens Hollow transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Dr. Vance's colleagues arrived from Miskatonic University, bringing with them an array of esoteric equipment and ancient tomes. The village square became a makeshift research center, filled with the hum of strange machines and the murmur of scholars debating cosmic theories. As they worked, the phenomena intensified. The whispers became a constant presence, rising and falling like otherworldly tides. Villagers reported time distortions, moments where the world seemed to freeze, or hours that passed in the blink of an eye. The very fabric of reality appeared to be fraying at the edges. It was Dr. Armitage, a linguist specializing in dead languages, who made the crucial breakthrough. He discovered that the whispers, when properly translated, formed a complex mathematical equation, a formula for bridging dimensions. "It's not just an echo," he explained to Dr. Vance, his eyes wild with equal parts excitement and terror. "It's a set of instructions. The entity is trying to teach us how to open the door ourselves." The implications were staggering. If they could understand the formula, they might be able to rescue Daniel Lockhart, but in doing so, they risked unleashing the very horror they sought to contain. As the team debated their next move, Mara appeared in their midst, her unseeing eyes somehow finding Dr. Vance in the crowd. "It's time," the old woman said, her voice carrying an otherworldly resonance. "He's calling for us. For you, Eleanor Vance." Before anyone could react, Mara began to chant in a language that hurt the ears and mind to hear. The air shimmered, and suddenly, the bustling square was gone. Dr. Vance found herself standing on a vast, dark plain under an alien sky, the same landscape from her dreams. And there before her stood Daniel Lockhart, or rather something that had once been Daniel Lockhart. His form flickered and shifted, sometimes appearing human, other times taking on shapes that defied description. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a chorus of whispers. "You've come at last." Dr. Vance steeled herself, fighting against the vertigo of the impossible realm. "Daniel," she said, "we're here to bring you back, to close the door for good." A sound like laughter, but utterly devoid of mirth, emanated from the Daniel thing. "Close the door? Oh, Eleanor, the door was never meant to be closed. It was meant to be thrown wide open." As he spoke, the landscape began to shift. The dark plain cracked and heaved, and from the fissures emerged countless silent ones, their blank faces turned towards Dr. Vance. "You see?" Daniel's voice reverberated through her very being. "They're waiting for the silence to claim all of existence. And you, Eleanor Vance, hold the key." With horrifying clarity, Dr. Vance understood. Her research, her very presence in Valens Hollow, had been part of the entity's plan all along. She had been its unwitting tool, furthering its goal of manifestation. But in that moment of revelation came a spark of defiance. Dr. Vance thought of the villagers, of her colleagues, of all those who fought against the encroaching silence. She thought of Daniel Lockhart, the man he had been before all this began. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't be your instrument. This ends now." Drawing upon every scrap of knowledge she had gained, every theory and ritual she had studied, Dr. Vance began to speak. The words that left her lips were not her own, but rather a synthesis of countless languages, a formula that rewrote the very laws of reality. The Daniel thing howled, a sound of fury and desperation that shook the foundations of the realm. The silent ones pressed closer, their mouths opening in soundless screams. But Dr. Vance did not falter. As the final words left her lips, the world around her began to fracture. Cracks spread across the sky, and the silent ones crumbled to dust. The Daniel thing reached for her, its form unraveling. "What have you done?" it wailed, its voice fading. Dr. Vance felt herself falling, dissolving, becoming one with the collapsing realm. Her last conscious thought was a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Triumph that she had thwarted the entity's plan, sorrow for the price that had been paid. In Valens Hollow, the assembled researchers watched in awe and terror as Dr. Vance and Mara vanished before their eyes. In the next instant, a shock wave of silence swept through the village, extinguishing all sound for one heart-stopping moment. When the silence lifted, the whispers were gone. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Valens Hollow for so long had vanished. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from the world. In the days that followed, as the researchers packed up their equipment and the villagers began the long process of healing, stories began to circulate. Some claimed to have seen Dr. Vance in their dreams, standing watch at the threshold between worlds. Others swore they had glimpsed Daniel Lockhart, whole and human once more, walking into the sunset beyond the village limits. But these were just stories, whispers in the night. What remained was a village forever changed, a group of people who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. And if sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, a faint whisper could be heard on the wind, well, that was just the price of knowing that beyond the veil of reality, silent watchers stood eternal vigil against the encroaching dark. For in Valens Hollow, they knew now that true silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and unknowable, waiting just beyond the edges of perception. And in that knowledge lay both terror and hope, a legacy that would echo through generations to come.